Um, so yeah, I mean that's neoliberalism, and I think the sort of the focus that capitalist realism puts on neoliberalism is to sort of frame it in those terms of how it manages to sort of conceal the externalities that it incorporates. So by that I mean as as a powerful hegemonic situation, it, like I said a minute ago, it sort of attempts to represent itself as a totality, the totality of society. But because that's ridiculous, within its discursive representation, there are things that aren't it. There are antagonisms and there are disagreements and there are things that are just not neoliberal, and its externalities within its social community or political community, and the power of its hegemonic practice is to conceal those differences, to conceal that externality or those externalities, of course, and carry on sort of regardless, to somehow convey to its legitimizing factors, the people at large, that that it is actually legitimate. And it was so successful, it managed to do that to the point where the left, like I said already, vacated. The left became centrist, and signaling to everyone that there was no other way. The third way was the way forward: pragmatism, post-political, a politics without frontiers, and reading Lachlan Mouffe, and they do quite a bit on like group psychology and Freud and all that, and the what is it, the thing, the sort of the thing that brings people together, is the libidinal drive and love, and but sort of as the sort of constituting the other side to that is hate and social division, and they basically, I'm still missing like a few of the links. I'm still not there yet, but they use that as a foundation to argue that that you can't take the political away from people. You can't suppress the urge to express social divisions. So as soon as the left vacated the left and declared the end of a left-right dichotomy, and instituted a political without frontiers, they robbed the political institutions and robbed people of that impulse, that avenue to express that impulse, leading to, so because it wasn't, because the common sense that existed, there was very little public space for that expression. So it wasn't as if people were like, oh God, I can't vote for the left, or I can't vote for the far right. I've got to vote for this thing, and that's ridiculous. And there wasn't like a palpable conversation in the street. I mean, there was, particularly around like in Ireland when in 2007 with the Lisbon Treaty. Like there is moments, but by and large, that conversation really wasn't taking place, and people didn't feel. I mean, because of the community that we were in, we were comfortable enough expressing those urges and bringing up that. But I don't feel that without that community, if I was on my own, sort of like away from that community now that I am, but back 10, 15 years ago, I wouldn't have felt comfortable sort of bringing up that issue, because the social space, out in the public was sort of like, oh, don't rock the boat sort of thing. And
sure.
And I think that that led to that suppression.
Mm.
And when when you suppress something, you're adding a pressure to it, and it builds up, and it causes ruptures elsewhere,
Mm-hmm.
which sort of has come to a bit of a, it's managed like enough ruptures in the last say 5 years. Enough ruptures have sort of taken place that they've managed to identify. They've managed to they can see across. You can see across in America. We can see across in England, Ireland, whatever, in France, and something's happening here. So that they start to identify with something other than their grievance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that suppressed feeling amounts to an eventual momentary rupture, but that those ruptures are happening at such a frequency, they're attempting to identify, or they're beginning to identify with each other, and that's the sort of moment when that neoliberalism representing itself as a totality without externalities peels away. The representation sort of crumbles, and we're getting something else.
Mm. No, I mean, definitely, I can definitely associate with your points about, had we not had those particular social circles, or that particular sort of, I guess, I don't know, positive incubation that we had for being able to express ideas and being able to act and organize in quite radical ways, as opposed to, say, where I would have come from before, which again would have been that exact description was, don't rock the boat. Because, and I think this is what was quite astounding for me reading Fisher's book in the beginning, was because obviously being aware of, going up through, with what we were doing in Ireland, and how what that was all about, the conversations we were having and the ideas I was getting to hear, slowly transferring into, obviously, then meeting slightly more radical groups and starting to hear bits about anarchism and socialism from more organized groups in town that were doing bigger things, and moving out of Ireland and actually traveling to suddenly be surrounded by even larger groups of people.
Yeah.
This was something that, if I consider what I read in Fisher's book, especially, when he's basically breaking down, or at least shining some light on how one could, I suppose, re-inject politics into these various aspects of society, of organized society that we have now, or at least this is my reading of it. The place that I came from pre starting to have these conversations, you didn't rock the boat. There was no alternative.
Yeah.
And I think that was what gave me quite a fright reading into this, because, it had been, I hadn't read anything as I think blunt and as quick to read as capitalist realism, was, considering my growing up and thinking just how institutionalized this had been, that it hadn't even been something that had occurred to me. And I, as part of that sort of that age bracket, will have just continued on with that. It's not an even case of we had known anything different, except I, being part of that group, we had starting to be surrounded by some of these more radical left-wing sort of ideas. Had I not had that, I would have just carried on this entrenched, there is no alternative, probably into my later years.
I even think that the things that we were doing was like, as you say, like without knowing anything else, like a direct reaction. Like, I wonder if we were born 20 years before we had been, under all equal circumstances, would we have been like mad, like quasi-parliamentarian communists? Because we're coming of age at a time when this apoliticism was its tour de force, like, and as dissidents, as burgeoning dissidents of it, we attached ourselves to an apolitical ideology that said, no, there's no hope of gaining any ground through parliamentary politics. Let's just demand its total eradication, regardless of what everyone else thinks. And but yeah, so I wonder, like, was neoliberalism so powerful that it dictated to us our avenue for dissent in such a to such an extreme that it was rendered useless, which is actually, I think, touched on in the next either next half of this chat or the next chat, when they're talking about the postmodern movements and resistance, instead of resistance and reaction, instead of something sort of more profound and radical.
I mean, in some ways, neoliberalism has been pretty comfortable with the, you know, anti-capitalist movements of the late 90s and kind of early to mid 2000s. And since, I think, the Occupy movement in response to the financial crash in the West, that kind of dissent has been pretty much commodified, really. In that it's become part of kind of mainstream media narratives, you know, late night talk shows, Hollywood movies, that kind of narrative of being, you know, anti-establishment to such a degree that you can even talk about diverse types of sexuality, problems with capitalism.
11,000 spices and no chicken.
Yeah. The fact that all of the things that we would have been talking about, like even just abortion, feminism, that were completely, you know, radical in the early mid 2000s, are now part of absolute mainstream discourse, and yet the stakes politically are, you know, more grave than they even were back then.
Absolutely. Jesus. The is Leo Varadkar, is he a Stardy? Wasn't a Stardy government?
But he's certainly pro that now. I mean, his response to the housing crisis is, you know, just get the businesses building more houses.
So that's that. I mean, that says it all. Like the amazing sort of social advances that Ireland has made under Leo Varadkar, but in terms of sort of extricating ourselves from the democratic onslaught that politics represents is just how limited.
And I think it's interesting that you were saying kind of the alternative that was available to us in you know, that time 20 years ago was you know, democratic politics is not working, and I remember arguing with you at the time that that was too extreme a position. But like, look now, I mean, we have the same problems. We've got growing inequality, but now we have a burning planet.